As Thomas Harlow followed Jack into what appeared to be the office, he quietly closed the door behind them. He looked at Jack. "It seems you've taken quite a liking to the girl." Jack slowly turned his head. The look in his eyes alone carried enough warning. Thomas immediately understood. He gave a slight cough. "Well, there are a few other matters I'd rather discuss. As you may already know, the time to collect the gold and silver from the crime families is drawing closer, and I've managed to find out how they move those assets across the borders. A few of my informants have uncovered which countries, which towns, and even the aliases they use." Jack nodded for him to continue. Thomas folded his hands behind his back. "You may also remember the banker I mentioned a few days ago, the one heavily in debt. It turns out his bank is quite strategic with the loans it issues." Jack looked at him. "Let me guess. They loan money to people who have little chance of paying it back, and once they default, they're forced into indebted servitude. The bank then supplies those people as laborers, construction, factories, and wherever else they're needed." Thomas nodded almost immediately. "Exactly. But here's where the crime family becomes involved. The banker's brother is one of its members. He uses the bank to trap people in debt. Once they can no longer repay what they owe, they're forced to work, and from there they're quietly sold wherever labor is needed." He paused. "After all, once someone becomes a slave, they rarely ever regain their freedom." Jack's expression remained unchanged. "A system I find quite absurd." Thomas nodded. "Both brothers are driven by greed." Jack folded his arms. "Of course they are. So that's the angle we'll use. We won't offer them a way out. We'll offer them a way to become even wealthier." Thomas smiled faintly. "Exactly. It seems that every now and then a few slaves simply disappear. They're taken somewhere outside the city. The goods they produce are then sold elsewhere." Jack glanced toward the ceiling. "Another slave camp." Thomas nodded. "Something along those lines." He paused. "The proposal I have is that we sell them the same machines we sold to the crime families. They certainly have the resources to print the money." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "That's true. It could work. But first we need to determine whether they're truly that greedy." He looked back at Thomas. "And I take it you've already discovered when they hold their annual gathering?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, I have. They hold a large gathering every year, a ball, or perhaps you'd rather call it a business party. They invite merchants, bankers, and a handful of influential businessmen. They're always looking for new business opportunities."
Jack looked at Thomas. "Good. Let's become someone who piques their curiosity, someone they'd like to become acquainted with. Buy a few factories there, perhaps a mine or two, and also open an account at their bank. After all, businesses need to pay salaries. They conduct transactions every day. So, let's do exactly that." He paused. "And let's see if we can pique their curiosity enough. After all, I take it I still have some time before this ball or business gathering takes place?" Thomas Harlow nodded. "About 3 to 4 months." "Good," Jack replied. "That should give us enough time to determine exactly which angle we'll take. After all, we should be a little cautious, especially since we've already made a temporary arrangement with the crime families operating in Brascan and the surrounding areas. But I also want to know whether they have any connections with the ones farther north." Thomas Harlow nodded. "Actually, that particular group prefers doing business farther north. They conduct very little business in this area. It seems that most of the crime families and their associates have reached an unspoken agreement. They avoid interfering with one another's territories." Jack gave a faint smile. "Well, that's organized crime for you. They always seem to have some sort of understanding." But I still want you to keep an eye on everything happening there. If necessary, send a few more men." He paused before continuing. "There's something else. I want you to locate every place our current allies among the crime families use, their warehouses, their routes, and the methods they use to move their goods. You mentioned that they operate across the borders, not just into one country, but into several." Thomas nodded. "Yes, some shipments travel farther north. Others are moved into nearly every country bordering the Khadrasar Empire." Jack rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Interesting. Let's find out everything we can. It may prove useful to us in the future." He looked back at Thomas. "And regarding our banker, I want to know exactly how his bank operates, whether it offers vault services, whether wealthy merchants store valuables there, and whether there are any other opportunities we can make use of." Thomas nodded. "We'll look into it." Jack gave a satisfied nod. "Good. That's all for now. Look into those matters for me, and report back as soon as you have something. As for the rest, there are a few matters I'll have to deal with myself." Thomas nodded respectfully before leaving the office. Once the door closed behind him, silence settled over the room. Jack reached into his coat and removed a sealed envelope. It was the one Prince Alaric von Falkenwall had given him. He looked at it quietly for a few moments before a faint smile crossed his face. Well, those two, they'll be taken care of shortly. Some time later, Geshny returned with Lydia. Jack looked at the two of them. "Lydia, you can go ahead and put your things away. Choose whichever room you'd like. We'll only be a few minutes." Lydia nodded quietly. Holding her belongings close, she made her way upstairs to settle into her room. Once she had disappeared from sight, Jack turned his attention back to Geshny. "Geshny, come in." She stepped into the office. Jack looked at her. "Well, we're going to handle a few things. I take it the boat is ready." Geshny nodded. "Yes. And just as you requested, it's been furnished with everything necessary, all of the comforts. And for transportation, we can simply use the same men we normally use for the train." Jack gave a satisfied nod. "Good." He remained silent for a moment before asking another question. "Tell me, out of curiosity, have you ever heard of what the nobles call the trial of chains?" The question caught Geshny off guard. Her expression changed for the briefest moment. She looked at Jack. "Blood Isle." The words escaped her mouth almost instinctively. She immediately fell silent. Jack studied her for a moment. "That's an interesting name." He folded his arms. "As far as I know, that's what the slaves call it." He looked directly into her eyes. "And, if I remember correctly, when we first met, you weren't exactly a slave anymore. But you were someone who wanted to get rid of a certain individual." Geshny nodded. "Yes. And you showed me a trick or two, how to solve that problem without anyone ever noticing." Jack gave a slight nod. "I remember." He remained silent for a moment. "So tell me, out of curiosity, were you once a slave?" Geshny lowered her head. "Yes, as a child." Jack nodded slowly. "And regarding Blood Isle, as you call it, I take it you were one of the survivors. Or perhaps you escaped." Geshny remained quiet before answering. "I escaped. I eventually made it to another country, and I started doing work there." She gave a faint smile. "Then the incident happened. The one where you taught me a different way of dealing with someone." Jack nodded. "Yes. And I also showed you how to handle that particular problem." He looked at her carefully. "I take it your escape from Blood Isle had something to do with your rather unique magical ability." Geshny slowly nodded. "You could say that. one of the boats overturned. Unlike everyone else, I didn't run toward the safe zone. I went looking where the boats had been. She paused. The rest of that story I'll tell another time. There was a hint of sorrow in her voice. Jack simply nodded. I suppose that isn't the most important matter right now.
He folded his arms once more. In another week or two, they'll be holding another trial of chains. We're going to interfere with their little game. But it has to look like an accident. He glanced toward the office door before looking back at Geshny. So make sure all the necessary arrangements are made. Prepare the boat and prepare yourselves, because this journey will be an interesting one. He paused briefly. I'll contact one or two more people myself. There's someone whose expertise may prove useful. He looked toward the office door. I take it Darian has managed to find us a doctor by now, or at the very least, a nurse. Geshny nodded. Yes. Jack leaned back in his chair. It's rather interesting. The ones who question the system, the ones who think for themselves, they're always the first to be punished. He looked directly at Geshny. I don't intend to punish people like that. Don't you agree? Geshny simply nodded. She wasn't quite sure how to respond. Jack spoke calmly. What I mean is this. Whenever someone begins asking the right questions, those who profit from corruption become afraid. They fear anyone capable of exposing them, so they silence them, they remove them, they oppress them. He paused. So here's a word of advice. Share your thoughts with those who value wisdom, with those who seek the truth, and with those who refuse to oppress it. He stood from his chair. But for now, do what needs to be done. Prepare the boat. After all, this is going to be quite an interesting journey. A faint smile crossed his face. But tomorrow, I'll be collecting my payment. Jack pointed toward the office door and looked at Geshny. That's all from me for now. Just make sure a few things are taken care of, and don't let your emotions get the better of you. I'm also going to gather some information about these games, or whatever it is the Melbills prefer to call them, but I'll make sure everything stays in order. As for tomorrow, like I said, I'll be making my rounds. The following morning, Jack, accompanied by Thomas Harlow, Darian, and a handful of trusted men, set out to collect the payments. As expected, none of the crime family members caused any problems. The collections went smoothly. However, there was one man in particular who requested to speak with Jack privately, an elderly man by the name of Benedict Shaw. He greeted Jack with a faint smile. Would you care to join me for a drink or two? Jack glanced toward the wagons where his men were loading the payments. While they're busy loading everything, I don't see any harm in it. The two men entered a luxurious establishment nearby. Once they had taken their seats, Benedict poured 2 glasses before speaking. You know, Brascan isn't actually where I operate most of the time. I mainly conduct my affairs from one of the 2 smaller towns outside the city. He smiled faintly. They're rather pleasant places. Jack nodded. I've always found the countryside to be quieter, and sometimes a far better place to spend one's time. He looked at Benedict. Any place you'd particularly recommend? Benedict chuckled softly. I suppose that depends on a man's taste. He took a slow sip from his drink before looking back at Jack. Out of curiosity, how do you think someone survives in this line of work for so many years? Jack answered without hesitation. By being cunning, clever, ruthless, and above all, intelligent. Benedict smiled. Those are all excellent answers, but let me offer you a word of advice. He leaned forward slightly. Always remember this. A nail that stands up always gets hammered down. Jack quietly listened. Benedict continued. People tend to fear those they believe possess greater potential than themselves, so remember that. Jack looked at him thoughtfully. What exactly do you mean by that? Benedict simply smiled. You're intelligent enough to figure it out, so I'll leave you with only that. A nail that stands up always gets hammered down. Not long afterward, Jack, Thomas Harlow, and Darian climbed back into their carriage. For a while, none of them spoke. Then Jack finally broke the silence. What information have you gathered on Benedict Shaw? Thomas Harlow thought for a moment. He's an interesting man. Despite being one of the oldest members of the crime families, he's also managed to hold his position longer than almost anyone else. He isn't among the most powerful, and yet, as far as I know, no one has ever seriously attempted to have him killed. Thomas paused. He's also different from the others. There are certain businesses and certain dealings he refuses to involve himself in. Jack looked out the carriage window. Interesting. He remained silent for a few moments. Keep a closer eye on him for me. There's something about him that has piqued my curiosity. Thomas looked at him. If I may ask, what exactly are you wondering? Jack smiled faintly. You've heard the saying, no plan survives the battlefield. Thomas nodded. Of course. Jack continued. Well, sometimes you also find an ally on the battlefield, one you never expected. Thomas considered those words. Are you suggesting that Benedict Shaw could become a silent ally? Jack slowly shook his head. No, I can't say that. Not yet. But he has certainly piqued my curiosity, and I do believe he's different from the others. I'd simply like to find out in what way. He paused. By the way, I take it you've gathered more information regarding what the nobles call the trial of chains. Thomas nodded. Yes, I've managed to gather additional information regarding the trial of chains. Jack leaned back in his seat. Good. Within the next few days, we'll be leaving for that area. You'll remain behind and continue collecting payments from the remaining crime families. After that has been taken care of, I'll turn my attention to the banker. He looked back at Thomas. I also take it you've begun making the arrangements I asked. The mines, the factories, and the other investments. Thomas nodded. Yes, I've already had several of our men begin making offers and putting everything into place. Jack gave a satisfied nod. Good. I have a feeling those investments may prove useful to us in the future. So let's see exactly what opportunities they create. Thomas Harlow suddenly looked at Jack. Oh, before I forget, one of my men reported something rather interesting. It seems someone has been keeping an eye on both you and Geshny. We chose not to intercept the individual. Jack looked at him. Most likely someone sent by one of the crime families. The carriage continued rolling through the streets of Brascan. Jack glanced out through the window before speaking again. Out of curiosity, do you think anyone is following us now, or anyone you've noticed watching us? Thomas slowly shook his head. No, and that's actually the part that concerns me. Jack looked back at him. How so? Thomas folded his arms. The people watching the two of you never remained the same. It changed every now and then, so whoever's giving the orders is rather clever. They're also careful. It's not as though they're constantly following either of you. They only appear every now and then. Jack thought for a moment. Did your men notice anything that stood out?
Thomas shook his head. Nothing. Jack looked at him. Was Geshny followed this morning? Thomas nodded. Yes, but only for a short while. Jack leaned back slightly. Interesting. He remained silent before asking another question. And how are things progressing with the police stations? Thomas nodded. My men have continued gathering information. They believe someone else is also quietly collecting information. They aren't entirely certain who, but they're convinced someone is working behind the scenes. Jack nodded calmly. That was to be expected. He looked toward Thomas again. There's something else I'd like you to find out. I want to know exactly where the Assassin's Guild operates here in Brasken, and, more importantly, who runs it. Thomas listened carefully. Jack continued. I have a feeling we'll need to deal with them, perhaps within the next few months. But until I have more information, I'd rather not move against them. Thomas nodded. I already have one of our men looking into that. To be honest, I believe he's more than capable. He's been excelling these past few months. Jack raised an eyebrow. Anything particularly exceptional about him? Thomas smiled faintly. Not when it comes to magic, but put almost any weapon in his hands, and he masters it as though he'd been born using it. Jack nodded thoughtfully. Fascinating. Thomas continued. He also seems to share many of our ideals, and he has his own reasons for opposing the people we're dealing with. Jack looked at him. Do you think he's someone we could eventually promote? Thomas confidently nodded. My men have already investigated him. Everything checks out. He's loyal. Jack gave a slight nod. Good.
Not long afterward, the carriage came to a stop outside one of Jack White's buildings in Brasken. The upper floor had gradually become their temporary residence. Over the following days, Jack remained occupied, ensuring everyone understood their responsibilities and how the next phase of their plans would unfold. Before long, Henrik returned. Alongside him came Goran, and another man. Once everyone had gathered, they made their way through Brasken toward the wide river that flowed through the city. Merchant vessels drifted along its waters, while riverboats of every size moved steadily between the docks, carrying people and goods to destinations far beyond the city. Moored along one of the quieter piers waited their own riverboat. After loading their supplies aboard, they quietly cast off from the dock. The current slowly carried them away from Brasken as the city gradually disappeared behind them. Their destination lay far from civilization, an island where the nobles held what they proudly called the Trial of Chains, an island the slaves had long since renamed Blood Island, a place where countless lives had been wagered for the amusement of others, and where their next journey would begin.